All right. Let's move on to the next one. Yep. All right, so with that being said, we would like to welcome you to the ALASC speaker event on the topic of inclusivity, featuring our ALA president, Lessa Kanani'opua Pelayo-Lozada. We're very excited to have her join us this evening. Lessa is the 2022 to 2023 president of the American Library Association and Adult Services Assistant Manager at the Palos Verdes Library District in Southern California. She was the 2019 to 2022 Executive Director and 2016 to 2017 President of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association. In 2022, she received the American Library Association Elizabeth Futas Catalyst for Change Award and was named a Library Journal Mover and Shaker in the advocacy category. Much of her work focuses on advocating for equity, diversity, and inclusion in libraries and librarianship. She lives in San Pedro, California with her poet husband, Chrisitan Hanz Lozada, and their menagerie of pets. Before we hand the microphone over to Lessa, we want to hear from you all. So what does inclusivity mean to you? So some of you all might be familiar with Padlet, but if not, I'm going to show you what it looks like. And I'm going to copy that into the chat. So feel free to hop on here. It's in the chat for you all to see. Basically, what you can do is there's this little button on the bottom right, and you can type in just right here where the subject is, what you think inclusivity means to you, and just hit publish, and your answers should pop up. So go ahead. We'll take about a minute just for people to populate their answers. Acceptance. And don't worry, whatever your answers are, it's going to be anonymous. So feel free to write whatever you like. See, all voices are heard, creating space for all people of all identities, openness, being seen and included, equitable voice. I like that one. No one left behind. Diversity, acceptance, building towards a beautiful future. Oh, I like that one. Empathy, feeling welcome. Just wait a few more seconds. Group creativity. Including everyone of gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, or other factor. I love all of these answers. Alrighty, so thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts with us. Feel free to keep adding to this Padlet throughout the presentation as we'll do a final recap of your responses again right before we wrap up. But let me go back to our presentation. And now I'm going to turn the microphone over to Lessa, and we hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much, Lessa.
Thank you, Iori. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all and share a little bit about what inclusivity means to me and where and how I see it showing up in the library world. But before I get into that, I would like to share a little bit about where I come from, because I feel that the roots of who I am is in the work that I do and why I do it in libraries. So on this slide here, for me to share my journey towards inclusivity, I have to start with where I come from. So those are my grandparents, Al and Mary Pelayo. I am an American of mixed race, Native Hawaiian descent, and my Native Hawaiian culture believes strongly in the strength of our wisdom and our ancestors informing who we are, where we come from, and where we are going, which is why I start with my grandparents. So they instilled in me, my siblings, and my cousins, and I guess my parents and my aunts and uncles too, but whatever, a life of service, which in Hawaiian we call kukua. Next slide, please. So we believe in kukua to others and our community, regardless of who they are or their background. All are part of our family, our ohana, and deserve our help. My grandparents demonstrated a life of service to us by growing the Hawaiian community in Los Angeles away from our homeland, creating civic clubs, festivals, and supporting hula schools, perpetuating a cultural life for Hawaiians in California. They helped to expand our community and ensure future generations were connected to our culture, even if we were unable to live on the land of our ancestors. In addition to kukua, they and my parents also ingrained in us the Hawaiian value of kuleana, or responsibility. This sense of responsibility and my slant towards service is a core foundation of my interest and work in libraries, as well as a core tenet of my leadership style, servant leader, and I of course have them to thank. So rooted in kuleana, which is responsibility, and kukua, which is service or support, and as the oldest child and grandchild, I feel I was uniquely positioned to take on a more non-traditional leadership role within my life. And I didn't know that it would start at the library. And I want to say that when I am talking about leadership, I feel that leadership and inclusion are intrinsically intertwined. But when I'm talking about leadership, I'm not talking about being the first to speak up or be the one who says the most. I don't think leadership is just sitting at the head of the table or having the title of direction or manager for directors or director or manager, because directors and managers are not always leaders. To me, leadership is supporting my colleagues, offering to collaborate together, and making sure the job gets done, not to perfection, but to the best possible result as harmoniously and humanely as possible. I look at folks who are supportive, collaborative, empathetic, and accountable, all traits that I saw would thrive in a human-centered library setting. Next slide, please. So for me, this human-centered work in library begins at a very young age. I started as a library kid, probably a surprise to nobody, who loved reading and would go to the library almost every day after school. One year, I was even the first person in my community to finish the summer reading program, where I got to take this picture as a bookworm and have it proudly displayed for all to see. The librarians there always welcomed me, always helped me find books that interested me, and ensured that I felt included in the space. And that foundation of connection and independence with the library would enhance my passion for literacy and learning, one that was at the core of who I am, thanks to parents who let me read anything and everything that I wanted, who never told me a book was too hard for me, and a mom who worked as a library technician at the community college library, where I would eventually attend and graduate from. This foundation set me up for success as a first-generation college student when I needed to decide my future and did not have parents who necessarily knew how to help me navigate college and pick a career. Next slide, please. So just a shout out to all you other first-generation college students out there, or who are the first in your family, also who are going back to school later in life. I want to emphasize that getting that degree, making that journey is a very brave experience, and also is leadership and is leading by example in and of itself. And while we know it's not an easy path, it is one that opens so many doors for you and your family to see it as a possibility for themselves. Because we know that it can be hard to imagine the possibilities if you don't know what even your base options are. I had no idea what it meant to be a librarian, despite my mom working in a library. But when I decided to become a librarian, I learned that the field paired all of my favorite things together: research, reading, service to the community, learning, and working with children. But I lacked the community around me who understood what I was going through to fully execute that plan. So when I entered UCLA's LIS program while I was working at a bookstore, I knew what I wanted to do, but I needed people to help me figure out how to get there. In library school and in the library I was working in, I had wonderful, fantastic mentors and faculty advisors who helped me through a master's thesis focusing on Native Hawaiian cultural practices and oral traditions as a framework for disseminating information in a library setting. It was a thesis that felt brave, but was possible because others helped me imagine the possibilities. Next slide, please. So one of my mentors, Eloisa Bora, who is pictured here, would bring a group of Filipino librarians together every quarter for pizza and to chat. And although I'm only like an 8th Filipina and my great-grandfather came to Hawaii from the Philippines, my cultural knowledge was very small, but she still included me. And so without my realizing it, these mentors, all women, there was Eloisa, Clara Chu, Virginia Walters, so many women that I could name, brave leaders in our field, helped me feel like I belonged and like I had something to offer others. Because growing up, I often felt like I wanted to lead. I wanted to be in the room and have a seat at the table in that traditional sense, but I was never given the opportunity and didn't know that asking for it was something that I could do, or bringing my own chair to the table. I ran for student council in middle school and high school. I never won. I won like in second grade room representative, and that's about it. So I figured that the reason was because I wasn't meant to be in those spaces and I wasn't meant to be a leader. But these women began to show me that leadership looks different everywhere. And the type of leader I wanted to be was an inclusive one. Because sometimes leadership is volunteering to usher an author to an event when no one else wants to. Although honestly, who would not volunteer to usher an author to an event and get that one-on-one time? Still boggles my mind. And sometimes it's also writing a thesis on a topic that no one has researched before, or co-leading a group of enthusiastic future librarians in networking opportunities, sharing our favorite books, and what to many probably just looked like hanging out in a break room was leadership development and creating bonds and agendas for a common good, which ultimately is what inclusion is: relationship building and having everyone at the table. Next slide, please. So the importance of joining in and bringing others with you as we work towards inclusion cannot be understated. Without networks of folks seeing my potential when I couldn't and encouraging me to be brave and take risks and helping me seek opportunities, I was able to contribute not only in my library, but also in ALA. And I did need that push because by nature, to be honest, I am not much of a joiner. I never wanted to put myself out there for fear of rejection, also shyness and social anxiety. And although I was rooted in the values of service and responsibility, I didn't volunteer much until I was invited. So I also want to emphasize that invitation has played a key role in my development and has become core to my leadership style. So I try to invite as many folks along with me as I can. And I also encourage you to invite folks to come along with you. Because even if they don't seem interested now, for folks who are never invited to a whole lot in their life or have that lack of confidence, it can change how they see themselves and the world. And another good tenet of just being a good human to me is treating someone with the dignity and respect and friendliness they deserve just because they exist. So invite them along and you might make a new friend, partner, and colleague, whether through associations like ALA or through your work in your library. And inviting people to come along is also good for the profession and our libraries. We improve when we have many perspectives at the table, and we need them all, from ethnic and racial diversity to gender diversity, class diversity, regional diversity, abilities, and beyond. These perspectives are how we become the community-centered libraries that we are meant to be. That is how we come together to create, grow, and learn from the wisdom of the places and the people that we come from. And this is where I'll kind of move more into tonight's conversation, where inclusivity directly comes in. Next slide, please. So to me, inclusion means ensuring everyone is at the table and is heard, seen, and respected, just like a lot of the things that we saw in the Padlet. Ideally, it would mean equal feelings are being heard, seen, and respected, but our society, and more specifically libraries, are not in a place where I personally think equality is yet possible. Because it's not inclusion that is not possible, it's equality, which is why we have to start with equity in everything that we do. And when we start with equity, we have to also identify the barriers to inclusion. What prevents voices from being in our space? What prevents voices from returning to our spaces if they have had the courage to come in those doors? And what voices have been historically marginalized, and what barriers are in place that we, in our current time and place and position of power and privilege, what barriers can we actually do anything about? Because there are some that libraries can't solve everything in the systemic world, but we can try to solve a lot of things. And for me, inclusion also means ensuring that we are recognizing the intersectionalities of our colleagues and our communities, and not pigeonholing them into stereotyped arenas or not seeing the complexity of their identities. So the concept of intersectionality, just briefly to define, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, describes how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. So when we think about our intersectionalities, though, and per Crenshaw, we must always center it with race. Not think that race is the only identity we hold, but center it and understand how it relates to all of our other identities. And that's partially because race is the single greatest predictor of one's life outcome. So once we are able to do this, once we're able to see the humanness of one another and the complexity, then I think we can get to true inclusion. So how do we get there? We have to go first through inclusivity, the intentional act of creating those structures that require us to be inclusive, that require us to look at and identify intersectionality, and require us to work toward equality. For we cannot have inclusion without inclusivity, and we cannot have either until we are inclusive. Next slide, please. So what does this look like in practice, though? So there are multiple levels to inclusion in libraries, and I like to start and ground kind of inclusion in the mission statement of the American Librarians Association, which is here on the screen, which is to provide leadership for the development, promotion, and improvement of library services and the profession of librarianship in order to enhance learning and ensure access to information for all. So inclusivity, inclusion, equity, diversity, equality are baked into the mission of our association. But what does that look like in practice? Next slide, please. There are multiple levels to inclusion in libraries. They're all important and they all serve different functions, but I think work towards the same goal. For many who are just starting this work institutions, we have kind of this more surface level work, which includes creating diverse displays and collections, offering diverse programs that focus on real issues and education for members of the community, especially those who have been historically marginalized. And then we move kind of more to the intermediate level, which includes EDI audits of our collections and programs, which includes outreach and demographic studies of our communities to be able to target those who are not in the library and understand the barriers and challenges they face to engaging with us. And this outreach is not kind of the traditional outreach that we might think of in libraries, where we have a table and we share out what the library does. What I'm talking about are conversations within the community. There's one model of conversations that are used, which are Harwood conversations, which are more listening sessions, where you're not even necessarily talking about the library, but you're talking about the aspirations for the community, and then go back and figure out how the library can fit into those aspirations. So like one example was that came out of one of those Harwood listening sessions. And so I can't remember the library, but they needed a new stoplight. And they were like, well, what can the library do to get a new stoplight put in? Not a whole lot, not really our jurisdiction. But through the listening sessions, they identified courses to be able to help individuals understand how to talk at city council meetings, how to make proposals, what departments to go to. And so that was how the library was able to work in a different type of way and do a different type of outreach that really got into what inclusion looks like. And then I think kind of the highest level, and this is the core of where the real change happens, but is the most difficult, is the systemic level, right? So here I'm talking about policy changes, but more importantly, I'm talking about power sharing with the community rather than being top down. And like I said, this is the most difficult level because it kind of goes against how a lot of libraries traditionally work, where we tell the community what it wants. We tell the community what it needs to know. We tell them how to act in our space. We tell them how to behave. We tell them how to use the catalog. We tell them all of these things. And that's ingrained, right? Because the beginnings of many library spaces were kind of to be a morality police, for lack of a better word. So to also get people with undesirable, quotes, behaviors to properly socialize and be productive members of society in the way that we as library professionals at the beginning wanted them to. But now we have come a long way into being community spaces while trying to shed many of our old practices and habits and figure out how to share that power, respond to, and be proactive for our communities. So next slide, please. In the community, reaching the systemic level, like I said, looks like community-driven conversations and action. So one example of this is my library, the Palos Verdes Library District, hosts a living history museum every February for Black History Month and has done so for over 10 years. This idea was not library generated, but was community generated by groups of Black parents in our very white community who wanted their kids and their history to have a space and to be seen. That community plans and executes much of the program in partnership with the library. We take their cues, we provide the space, the logistical support, graphics, design, media promotion, and also help to recruit the kids of all backgrounds from many schools, both in and outside of our community. But our partners and those parents who came to us and asked for this space, who wanted to work with us to create this space, really still guide what it looks like and the different ways. It started with the Living History Museum, but they've tried to expand it also to a speech contest and an essay contest, and to be as inclusive as they can be, and to invite kids of all different communities to be able to share their favorite African-American hero and the history about them. So that's one example. Next slide, please. In the broader LIS field, it also looks like the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color. I think this is more kind of in the intermediate level. So the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color, these are pictures from the most recent one that were held, is a conference held every 4 years and is coordinated by the 6 national associations of librarians of color, each of which is a separate organization. So you can't just like join them all at the same time. So there's the American Indian Librarians Association, the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, the Black Caucus of the ALA, the Chinese American Librarians Association, Reforma for services to Latinos and the Latin-speaking countries, and the Joint Council of Librarians of Color. So this space, the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color, centers BIPOC practitioners to have the difficult conversations and to create solidarity amongst one another and with allies that is necessary to work in a field that is overwhelmingly white. In recent conferences, it has also looked greatly at intersectionality, rooting, of course, race, but looking at how race shows up in libraries and our queer community, our parenting community, how it shows up as being a Jewish person of color, all of the different things that go into making us as library workers and helping us to not only provide services for our communities, but to make sure that we stay in the field and don't burn out, because retention of librarians of color is not great, to say the least. Next slide, please. So library inclusivity in society. What does it look like in the broader realm of things? I'm going to bring it down a little bit now because I do want to go into what I think we all know is happening, but just to give background and statistics and to show what it really looks like. Next slide, please. It looks like banning books. Right? What we are seeing right now that we're going to get into is the banning of inclusion, essentially. Next slide, please. So our trusted library spaces have now become political battlegrounds for those who proclaim to be in favor of free speech and the First Amendment, but only as long as it aligns with their values and ideals and will support their political outcomes. In 2021, ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom tracked the highest number of challenged and banned books in its 20-year history. 729 challenges to library, school, and university materials and services resulted in more than 1,597 individual book challenges or removals. By comparison, in 2019, because 2020 is kind of a myth of a year that happened, but the statistics are not the same because everything was closed. So in 2019, ALA tracked 377 challenges in which 566 books were targeted. So that's half. half the number that would come in 2021, a number that doubled in less than 2 years. Next slide, please. And the preliminary numbers for 2022, and this snapshot is just from January to October of 2022. In 10 months, there were 781 challenges reported, resulting in 1,835 individual challenges. In those 10 months alone, we surpassed the number of individual challenges of 2021 because the reports coming in are grouping lists of books together, whereas previously they were individual titles coming forward for complaint. And these lists are organized efforts, organized attacks against the freedom to read and the freedom of speech by a vocal and aggressive minority. And just to note, the full 2022 numbers should actually be coming out sometime this week. So do keep an eye out. It'll probably either be tomorrow, which is Thursday, or Friday. I have seen them and they are terrible. The next slide, please. So what exactly are they banning? I'm sure you all know as LIS professionals, but they are banning books by and about LGBTQIA+ and Black and Indigenous people of color authors, characters, and histories, under the guise of being sexually explicit, pornographic, anti-police, and promoting specific social agendas. We know that the target is inclusion, and we know that the target are identities and stories that have been historically silenced to keep those in power in power. So that intersection of social justice and intellectual freedom, to many, is a difficult one to grasp, but to me, they need each other. We need intellectual freedom to bring stories that get us to justice to light. As a kid, I didn't have access to my own history as a Native Hawaiian in history books. I didn't understand the overthrow and occupation of Hawaii at the hands of American capitalists for their own benefit. All I knew was that my grandparents left and that it was and still is not easy to return because of soaring costs, danger to Native Hawaiians and our land, and an over-reliance on the tourism economy, and a feeling of not being welcome in your own home. If I'd had access to and an understanding of the fraught history of my people, just as books like the 1619 Project are bringing forward, we might have been able to figure out how to build a better path forward together sooner, and how to integrate equity into diversity and inclusion more intentionally, rather than assuming equality was that next step and goal. The essentialness of equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in intellectual freedom are inherent. And when we pair them also with principles like radical empathy, trauma-informed response, and cultural humility, we can see when arguments of neutrality are helpful and when they are not, and when we need to utilize other tools to ensure all who come through our doors feel seen, heard, and like they belong, regardless of those who want to silence them on the outside. Next slide, please. Because silencing is one of the real reasons that books are being challenged. Individuals seeking to silence diverse ideas and ultimately people. To silence, these challengers need to abolish free and equitable access to information and erode this country's commitment to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the freedom to read. When we allow a minority to trample on these freedoms, we encourage our youth to repeat the societal mistakes and perpetuate the divides ignited by cultural ignorance and lack of understanding of the lives of others. Because I want to emphasize, a minority of people it is that support book bans. In a bipartisan poll, red, blue, independent, across the political spectrum, conducted early in 2022, ALA found that 71% of voters across party lines oppose efforts to remove books from public libraries. Most voters and parents also hold librarians in high regard. They have confidence in their local libraries to make good decisions about what books to include in their collections. And they agree that libraries in their communities do a good job offering books that represent a variety of viewpoints. Next slide, please. So with these statistics in mind, as LIS professionals, you are all doing the work, but I also invite all of you to unite with us against book bans and make your voice heard in the public arena that we need to stop these efforts to ban together. We need to ask our policymakers to reject any efforts to ban books and allow individuals and parents to make decisions about what they and their families read. So please visit uniteagainstbookbans.org to learn more and join the efforts and take this message beyond the library world to our friends, families, and allies in all arenas. And just to note that right now there is the Parent Right to Read bill that is going to vote on the House floor tomorrow. It is HR 5. If you can contact your Congress people to have them vote against that, we would be very, very grateful for that, so that we don't have to continue this fight at the federal level as well as the local and state level. Next slide, please. I also encourage you all to report censorship if you are currently working in a library or you hear of it. So a lot of people ask, where is ALA? What is ALA doing for those experiencing challenges? At the American Library Association, the Office for Intellectual Freedom is supporting our library workers with one-on-one guidance from staff expertise, and also providing support to those individuals to talk through problems, provide guidance on policy creation, share talking points, attend meetings, and identify local support and local attorneys to assist. This work is all confidential and behind the scenes to protect those facing these challenges and ensure as much as we can that they don't face continued repercussions. So many individuals are afraid to say anything or have their names out there because they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to be doxxed, and we take that very, very seriously. So I want to emphasize that. We also provide policy guidance and support at ala.org/challenge reporting. ALA Selection and Reconsideration Policy Toolkit for public school and academic libraries provides library support, administrators, and trustees suggestions and information on why we choose the titles we add to library, school, media centers, and classroom collections. So again, if you're experiencing a challenge, you know somebody who is, please make sure they report it so that we have the accurate numbers and so that also we know what kind of support everybody needs right now. And as I say that, we know that support is not enough. We are also looking for ways to be proactive in this fight because we know it isn't going away anytime soon. It is time for us to lead the strategy, and we are working on ideas that we hope will take us there over the next year or so. Next slide, please. And I do want to do a pitch for, if you know folks, if library workers are facing discrimination in the workplace or have lost their job while defending intellectual freedom, ALA also has the Merit Fund, which provides financial assistance for library workers who are in the midst of discrimination of challenge crises. So I encourage you all also, if you have the means, I know you all are students and money is tight, but every little bit helps if you have the means to donate to the fund or share with your networks. Because in just 2 months last year, the Merit Fund supported 4 individuals when the yearly average used to be 2, and inquiries continue to come in. Next slide, please. So again, we cannot do this alone though. Us as library workers, we know we're in the right on this. We know we're on the right side of history, but we can't just be the only ones saying that. We have to have every single person in our society who supports the freedom to read, who supports libraries, to join Unite Against Book Bans with us, to also contact their Congress folks, their local politicians, to write letters to the editor of their newspapers, to write letters to their library directors, telling them how much they love their libraries, what impact having diverse collections, what impact the stories and services and programs in our libraries have had on their lives, because those stories are going to be basically what saves us in the end. So please share out the word. Force your family to join us in this fight. Force your friends. If they want to be our friends, they have to call. That's all there is to it. We're going to put stipulations on this now for the next year or so, but we cannot do this alone, and know that you all are not alone either. So the final question that I had was, how do you see inclusivity efforts in the LIS field evolving in the future? Next slide, please. And with that, I will respond with a quote by John Lewis, the Honorable John Lewis. "You must be bold, brave, and courageous and find a way to get in the way. The only way that we are going to get towards true inclusion is to not do things as we always have been, and to try new things, to open up doors and to open up our libraries to the communities that we say that we are serving. In LIS, we need to focus on those systemic and cultural issues. It goes beyond the Spectrum Scholarship for BIPOC students. It goes beyond funding. It goes beyond library funding. It has to be a cultural shift within our LIS programs on the types of things that we are studying, on the types of things that we are putting forward. And that has to be replicated once we get to those library spaces. It is not always easy leaving library school and getting into that library where folks have been working there for 10, 20, 30 years and doing it the same way where they are comfortable. We have to get uncomfortable to do this work. It's not always easy, and it is painful, and it is long. I'm not going to lie. I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now, and I don't know that it's getting easier, as we see with book challenges, right? But we have to remember that often, Haunani K. Trask, who's a Native Hawaiian scholar, says that resistance is the reward. Resistance is its own reward. And so knowing that we are doing this continues to be able to propel us towards true inclusion. Another issue towards true inclusion that we really have to look at in the LIS field is the tension between unpaid labor and service and our work. I don't have an answer for what that looks like, but a lot of what we do is completely volunteer to promote the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we need to challenge our institutions and force our institutions to put their money where their mouth is, so that we're not doing all of this, what is often also emotional labor, for free. So those of us, when you get into positions of power and privilege and can make these changes, these are the types of systemic changes that we have to make in order to have the field go forward and to have us continue evolving. So I do have some resources that I share on the next slide, please. They're very general. It's the National Associations of Librarians of Color. Anybody can join. I encourage you to do so, as well as the Spectrum Scholarship for BIPOC folk. If you are in your second year or entering your second year of your LIS program, you are still eligible to apply for a Spectrum Scholarship. It's not just for first year, so take a look at that if you need help, as well as the ALA Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. And I have these all. I just realized I'm going to drop them into the chat before I forget, because that slide is not helpful to you all. Hold on. Oh, and my keyboard doesn't work, so give me 1 second. Control C. Okay, got it. Nope, yeah, perfect. Okay, so, but the one that I want to highlight is the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, which is GARE. And so that has been very foundational to a lot of the equity, diversity, and inclusion work that I've done. Their focus is primarily on government institutions and working with city governments, but there are a lot of lessons that we can take in all sectors of LIS, I think, that come out of their toolkits and a lot of the writing that they have on their website. So I encourage you to check that out for your own education, as well as especially if you're going into public libraries, on ways that we can challenge ourselves to show up for our communities. So next slide, please. That is all I have for you for today. I am really interested in hearing what you folks think, what you're working on, also catching up a little bit with the chat that I saw go by. My handles are there, so please stay in touch. I'm always a DM or an email away. I love working with students. If you're going to be at ALA Annual in Chicago, please also let me know. I'm hoping to get with our membership office to host a mixer for students. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to meeting you all in person and hearing what you got.
Thank you so much, Lessa. Your presentation was so wonderful and so informative, and I have a feeling that everyone else feels the same way too. For all of you out there, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to put it in the chat. I can go ahead and read them for you, Lessa, or if you are able to look through the chat and you see some specific questions that you like, feel free to answer that as well.
Okay. I can see the chat. Oh, thank you, everyone. You're all so sweet. And I started as a library page too for County of Los Angeles Library. Go library pages. Also, if you guys have questions, if you folks have questions about like job market or just kind of general things, I'm also open to that. So here we go. What advice do you have for people who would like to one day work in library leadership as I have done? I would say definitely be open to possibilities. I think that one of the greatest things that I didn't know when I started my LIS program that I know now is the wide variety of leadership opportunities that there are within the field. It's not just, like I said, being like a manager, there's also leading projects. A lot of the EDI work that I did happened while I was a children's librarian, and I kind of forced it upon my colleagues, sending them notes on webinars that nobody asked for and being kind of passive aggressive about it. I would also say that I saw somebody say, a lot of us are introverts, and that is true. A lot of introverts come into the library field, but that also doesn't mean that you're not a library leader. We just sometimes lead differently and it looks a little bit different. And we also need a lot of downtime. So don't let that deter you from having big imaginations on what is possible. Because I will say, when I started library school, I was going to be a children's librarian, then I was going to be a branch manager, and then I was going to get my LIS degree and teach libraries. I've been a children's librarian, and that's about it so far, but I've also now been ALA president. So you never know where your path is going to take you. Oh, and thank you, Lindsay, for saying that the resist bot is super helpful. You can write letters by texting resist to 50409 to respond to HR5. I'm going to write that down too. Thank you.
Any other questions? We have a lot of time.
I could just ask it too. Is there anything you wish you'd done that you'd started in library school? So like a lot of these people, like we're in our first year. So like I'm graduating this semester, but a lot of people are still in it. Like, is there anything you wish that you'd known that you would have been like, I should have started this now while I was still in library school?
So I'm going to think about that. I will say one thing that I wish I'd studied in library school more is cataloging.
Interesting.
I was all about like programming and services, but a lot of also equity work comes on the cataloging and the metadata end, right? Because how we subject head things is how we search for things and how we're able to discover them. And so I think that the value of that is very underutilized, very misrepresented, misunderstood. But I think we need to pay more attention to that, because a lot of the work that we're doing now also is in EDI audits. And so if we don't know what subjects we need to look for that are incorrect also, right? So like Library of Congress used to have the subject heading illegal alien. And so they updated it after a lot of fights from ALA and other folks. Violet Fox gets a lot of credit for this. If folks follow her on Twitter, she's big in the cataloging world, to change it to undocumented immigrant, I believe was the change. And so like there's still a lot of room for improvement, but those changes take a long time. And so we have to be paying attention to what a lot of those outdated things are to be able to update them too.
Did anybody else put a question in? Because if not, I have another one.
So Emily asked, in what ways did I feel invited to join leadership positions? Looking for inspiration for ALASC's next round of elections. Excellent. So some of them were just invitations to run, right? They were like, hey, I see you come to a lot of our programs. We have this volunteer position open. Would you like to do that? We need a secretary. The thing about libraries is, especially if you're looking at smaller groups, is traditionally it's hard to get volunteers. And we have seen that a lot also over since the pandemic, right? Our priorities have changed, our capacities have changed, what we want to spend time on has. And so if you volunteer for something, the odds of you getting appointed to or onto that thing are usually pretty good. Elections are a little bit dicier depending, but I have seen a number of uncontested elections for very high level elections, right? The Asian Pacific American Librarians Association has, I believe, has had uncontested elections just because life happens and folks aren't able to volunteer. But even if you lose an election, like, don't take that as the end of the road. Definitely. We recognize that desire for leadership, that desire to lead. And so a good leader in that position will find some place for you in the organization. If you're looking for things to volunteer on, also just let me know. I can always route you to someplace that would be happy to have your service. So those are some ways that I was invited, but also don't be afraid to invite yourself if you think it's something that sounds really cool. And if you don't get it this time, you might get it the next time. And so Tanya asks, how does each library choose which books they ban? Is there a committee or board that votes on it? So it's different for each library. ALA has, like I said, recommended reconsideration policies as well as procedures. But I can tell you how my library does it. So we obviously don't ban anything or remove anything until we have received a formal request for reconsideration. So what happens in real book banning situations, we're not in like a real situation right now. We're in this microcosm of people sending lists. But what usually happens is like a parent or guardian, somebody will come in and say that they don't like this book on this shelf, they want it taken off. And then the library worker or librarian will have a conversation and explain collection development policy, how we want to be inclusive, how we provide many points of view. And often that is the end of the conversation. And they say, oh, okay, I get it. I don't love it, but we'll move on with our lives. So if they decide that they are not going to move on, though, then they will be asked traditionally to fill out a form that lists the name of the book, the author, and why they think it should be removed. So they have to explain like a mini essay kind of a thing. And then a committee of folks, often from different departments, like in my library, we get adult services and young readers on board. Those individuals will then read the material, discuss the complaint about it, and decide if it has merit. Sometimes a book might actually be in the wrong section. Maybe it was miscatalogued. Here you go. And it ended up in the youth section, but it should be in the adult section. So sometimes those errors do come to light, but sometimes they don't. And so that committee will then determine if the book will be removed or not. Some libraries, it goes through a board also. They can contest that to the Board of Library Trustees, but it just depends. But there is typically a committee that is involved. There have been reports of libraries and boards not honoring that process and just removing the books from the collection. And so we, of course, do not approve or condone that at all. So that's kind of like a quick process. But like I said, it's different for every library. Yay, cataloging. Oh, critical cataloging. Nice. See. Oh, who was the Hawaiian scholar who said resistance is the reward? Let me type it in here. Her name is Haunani K. Trask. She is also famous for, I believe it was going on PBS and saying that we are not Americans, we are illegally occupied, so get out of Hawaii, please and thank you. It's a good clip if you want to look it up. Michelle asks, what are your thoughts about using different classification systems, also with culturally appropriate subject matters and peripheral metadata for marginalized communities? For example, with Indigenous culture librarianship, we advocate utilizing custom systems such as Merkurtu CMS or the Brian Deere and/or Medicine Wheel classification schemes. I love that. I think that the more tailored we can make our libraries and how to make things findable for our communities, the better. And also, I will note that even if you're using like Dewey Decimal, you can change that too. You can change how things are cataloged in that. So for instance, traditionally, Indigenous creation stories are shelved in the 398 in the folktale and fairy tale section. But in my library, we actually did an overhaul. We went through the entire collection, pulled them out of 398 and put them into the 200s, the religion section. And so that's we're a small system, so we're able to do that pretty easily, but we did that system wide. So you can also make changes in that way, but absolutely, whatever classification system works for your library, use that one. And Emily asked, and also I didn't know about all of those, so I'm going to look them up afterwards. So thank you for that education point. I'm so far out of school. Emily asks, when did you realize you had gaps in knowledge about Hawaiian history, and how did you start the process of filling those knowledge gaps? So I knew that I had some gaps just because I didn't have even some of the same experiences as my siblings and my cousins did. There's like this Hawaiian summer camp where in 5th grade, everybody goes to Hawaii. They spend a week at Kamehameha schools and they learn about our culture. They learn language, they learn food. It's like a sleepaway camp for Native Hawaiian kids. I didn't get to go. So I started seeing those kind of knowledge differences when folks came back. And I was older than everybody else as well. And then in high school, I started really exploring my identity more and trying to understand more about my history. My grandparents, did a lot of cultural things for us, but the history was always in a very positive light. It was like, we belong to the state now. We belong to the United States now. Like our queen was imprisoned, but we're going to reenact like just a very positive way, very, their generation kind of a thing. So when I went to college, I went pretty hard. Like every single paper that I could write was on Hawaiian history, Hawaiian education, Hawaiian figures, so that I could get in as much as I could. And so I have a lot of book knowledge about Hawaii. And so having been born and raised in California also and lived my entire life here, I have to get a lot of that kind of like hands-on experience now as well. And just kind of those things that come with living there also that can't always be taught, but I know a little bit. So college was definitely the kicker for me. And I see Iori is wrapping us up.
Yes, thank you so much, Lessa, and thank you everyone for all your questions. This presentation, I'm going to be sending it out as a PDF for you all, so you'll be able to look at the things that Lessa talked about, and also her slide that she had for the contact information that will also be available for you all as well. So just be on the lookout for that. And we're gonna go ahead, as I mentioned earlier, we're gonna go through just kind of seeing a recap over our Padlet. If you want to add some more, you feel free to. If you don't want to, that's totally okay as well. Just kind of recapping what we had talked about. Relationship, what does inclusivity mean to you? Relationship building and making sure everyone is at the table, equitable ability to participate and for access, recognizing our differences, equitable voice, all voices are heard. I love all of your answers here, and you'll be able to look at this as well afterwards. So feel free to utilize this resource after the event if you'd like. And I want to go back. Once again, a big thank you to Lessa for taking the time to come speak with us. And thank you to all of our attendees. We appreciate you coming to this amazing event and for being thank you for continuing to support the ALA student chapter. And thank you again so much, Lessa. And our final wrap up, these are our upcoming events. I know that spring break is going to be next week, but we have 2 events coming up in April, the ALASC Career Development Workshop, as well as the Book Circle event. So please feel free to join us for those ones. And again, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to stay around. If you have any questions that you want to ask Lessa, again, her contact information will be available after event. Thank you.